Today marks 70 years since the landmark decision, Brown v. Board of Education, that outlawed school segregation. But still, 70 years later, nearly 7 in 10 Americans feel more should be done in schools to integrate them across the nation, according to a Washington Post Ipsos poll. And this feeling is not unwarranted. For example, the University of North Carolina Board of Trustees voted Monday to cut the school's diversity funding. The $2.3 million that funded the school's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts on campus will now go towards public safety and policing.
Many institutions and companies placed emphasis on DEI initiatives after the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. The announcement comes after the pro-Palestinian demonstrations at UNC and dozens of campuses nationwide. In a board meeting, Marty Kotis, vice chair of the budget committee at UNC, said, quote, "It is important to consider the needs of all 30,000 students, not just the 100 or so that may want to disrupt the university's operations." A dozen protesters disrupted another Board of Trustees meeting 2 days later, shouting, "Disclose, divest, we will not stop, we will not rest." Many were equally frustrated online, with one ex-user writing, quote, "So when BIPOC students expressed Palestinian solidarity, UNC took money earmarked to create an inclusive campus climate and gave it to cops to quell those students." But as expected, conservatives celebrated UNC's decision. X-account End Wokeness tweeted, "The UNC frat boys won." So there you have it, Jess. Another DEI program closing. This is not the first one around the country. The University of Texas, I believe, also previously shuttered their program as well. And I guess my question would be, what exactly was the purpose of these DEI programs, and were they even getting anywhere in achieving that purpose? Because I think in practice, what we often see is that these DEI departments, they cost a lot of money. They hire a lot of sort of middle managers who are supposed to make the campus or the business more inclusive. But when you get down to it, they don't end up doing a whole lot of anything.
It's different at every school. So where I went to graduate school at Brown, I was aware of some of the DEI programs that were there. And it sounds like a lot of them were mostly effective because they brought students together who were from these communities, who felt like the culture on campus didn't really reflect the culture they were used to growing up. Of course, a lot of America's biggest and most elite universities are majorly white, and we don't see large Black populations, large low-income populations. And so while a lot of the DEI official programming, I think, fell short in terms of integration, I do think the one good thing is they allowed these students to meet each other and sort of form those bonds and support of the validation of like, hey, there's not a lot of people like us here, at least we know each other. I think in admissions, it probably would have been more effective if they took into account the reality that there are a lot of students that are equally qualified, of members of races that are underrepresented, and there's still a lot of racist decision making, in these admissions boards. I think, the funding in allocating resources towards taking a closer look at these applicants probably would have been more effective in terms of, addressing the existing segregation we have in the US. But I think, to address this problem at its source, we would have to look at the problem at its first instance. In majorly non-white schools, we're seeing them receive $23 billion less than majorly white schools across the United States. It's an average that the non-white school district receives $2,226 less than a majorly white school district. And so when you have those resources being allocated with this bias across race, of course that's going to result in students that are in these districts that are majorly non-white not being as equipped to get to the highest institutions in our country, to go to Ivy League schools, to go to good schools like UNC. And so I really think we have to address that problem if we're really concerned about segregation.
Yeah, I agree that it's more of a primary school problem than a problem that the university should really be addressing. And one of the things that always bothers me about this conversation is you hear from a lot of liberals who really support public schools being unwilling to embrace school choice policies that would give parents the money that they pay in taxes for their kid to attend public schools in some kind of account or in a stipend so that they can attend a charter school or a private school or do home education, some kind of voucher program. And unfortunately, a lot of the Democratic Party receives major donations from the teachers' unions, and so they're reluctant to support these policies that could allow a student who is in a zip code that doesn't allow them to attend the best school to have the resources to make a different choice. I just wonder what you think about that, and if that could go somewhere towards helping to solve this problem. I know places like Florida and Arizona have implemented school choice programs with some great success in allowing people who traditionally would be priced out of private education of having that opportunity.
Yeah, I don't know. I think hand-picking certain students and means testing public policies, not only do they poll as really unpopular, I think it's because people want to see, any public resource allocation or any sort of program that results in less public funding going towards the public. So a lot of the structure for these programs is if you're donating to schools like charter schools, it's a big tax break. And so public schools, I think, should be publicly funded. I think our communities are stronger when we fund schools that way, and I don't think they suffice to address this problem we have of disparate funding. So the majority non-white school districts, that's school districts where students are 75% or more non-white, versus these majority school districts where students are 75% more white. I think this shows the exact problem that we have in equalizing some of that funding so they have the same quality of teachers teaching the students. Teachers are already taking major pay cuts compared to other professionals at their level of education. Really hard to find good talent. That's key to have good schools, but also funding for things like computer rooms, necessary, new textbooks, things of this nature that are problems that only money can fix. These disparities are really the main source of disparities later on in life when it comes to education and income level. And so we've got to address it for the whole population. I think a lot of these charter schools and private schools and lottery programs really fall short of addressing the problem that exists among the whole population.
Yeah, I guess the issue I have is that over the past however many decades with public school funding, we've been funding schools more and more, but it seems like the outcomes keep getting worse. We're now facing a crisis of literacy in the United States, even as we continue to pour more funding into public schools. The reason I view this these voucher programs as beneficial is that not only are the public schools not losing more money because the student who it would be paying for is no longer attending, but you also reduce the teacher to student ratio, which can be a huge benefit to the quality of education that students receive. But I want to go back to this DEI question at universities for a moment, because we haven't really dove into the real issue that's at stake here and why conservatives are cheering on UNC's decision. And it's because when these DEI programs are put into place, a lot of them end up being very divisive. And that is separate from the question of whether or not they become sort of a home for students who come from the same racial background to mingle. At Georgetown, when I was there, I don't recall us having specific DEI programs, at least they weren't called that. But there were certainly groups for African American students to meet up and hang out with one another, and I don't think anyone had a problem with that. But when we see DEI training programs, when we see the materials that come out in regards to what these universities are doing, they're often taking a tone of expressing that people who are in the majority class, just because they're white, are oppressive by nature, that they are benefiting from systemic racism. And when we look at the university system in particular, really, I view the problem more of a class issue problem than a race problem. What we saw in the UNC and Harvard case in front of the Supreme Court regarding affirmative action, it was that the racial classification system in America simply does not do a good job of capturing the real stratification and the lack of opportunities for students who come from low-income backgrounds. And as Coleman Hughes recently said quite artfully on The View, if you were to implement more programs that help people from lower income groups or lower class groups in America, you would end up capturing more African American and Hispanic individuals anyway because of the disparity in wealth. So you would be able to address these inequalities without making it a skin color issue. When we do these skin deep classifications, again, not only do we fail to capture the nuance of every individual, but we also end up getting these situations where someone who is the offspring of a wealthy businessman is counted the same as someone who comes from a Section 8 housing in the inner city for the purposes of racial classification and admissions and other programs throughout universities. So in that sense, I don't think DEI has really done anything to address these inequalities that we're talking about in our education system because it's really focusing on the wrong bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at our funding numbers for the education in total, a lot of times the amount that's allocated is not just dollars going towards classrooms and teachers. Since 2001, we've seen teachers' pensions triple as the share of funding going towards pensions versus classrooms, teachers, and students. And so the spending per pupil calculation is not really dollars going towards pupils. A lot of those dollars are going towards teachers' pensions, teachers who are retired drawing on those pensions, not currently in the classrooms with students. And so that's really concerning because as our population grows in the United States, we need to increase the amount of money that is actually going to the students, to the pupils, to the classrooms, to the teachers. And we've seen this sort of, silent defunding of our education. Now, when we look at the disparities across schools, we do see that this is reflected along racial lines. But even when we look within the same census tract, we are seeing that there's a disparity in outcomes between Black and white, students in the long-term outcomes. So if we look at the income disparity at the census tract level, and we're still noticing this down to, around 4,000 people in every census tract, if at the same neighborhood level, we're seeing disparities, obviously the problem won't be entirely fixed if we equalize funding across different schools, but I think it's a good first step. And to invest in programs that are DEI focused within the schools to say, hey, what is going on at the neighborhood level? Why are we seeing this difference in outcomes, even where we see the same kind of family makeup and we're comparing apples to apples among these households? Why are we still seeing these disparities? I think there needs to be some investment into that. But at the bare minimum, we need to equalize funding across schools and also increase the amount of funding that's actually reaching the classrooms, teachers, and the students.
We're totally out of time on this segment, but we're going to be back with more Rising after this.